Salam, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well. And I'm really excited to welcome you guys to tonight's conversation. For those of you that may not know, I'm Kashif Shaikh, co-founder and executive director of the Pillars Fund, an organization that lifts up and amplifies the voices, narratives, and talents of American Muslims. I'm really excited about this conversation today. It's part of our broader Pillars pop-up conversations. It's a series of conversations that I really want to make sure that highlight the voices of American Muslims. It's one thing that our team has done a really good job of is not only supporting and amplifying and supporting financially a lot of the organizations that we fund, but also being able to have these conversations in person. And one of the things that started to happen right as the pandemic really started to take over was my incredible team was able to put together a series of conversations with just amazing people. For those of you who've been with us in previous conversations, thank you so much. We're really excited about tonight's conversation. We're also very excited about next week's conversation, which we will be hosting Ramy Youssef, who some of you may know from his show Ramy on Hulu. He's a Golden Globe winner. We're really excited about not only having Ramy, but having two of his writers for the show of season 2, Mayt Al Hassan and Amir Suleiman. Ramy season 2 drops tomorrow on Hulu. And one thing we'd really encourage everyone to do is watch the show. Ramy's going to be taking questions about the show and including with the writers. And so please watch the show over the weekend. We're going to put up some links online to be able to ask us some questions. And we're going to try our best to really answer as many of them as we can, and also just have an engaging conversation about what it means to have a show like that today in today's climate. And my colleague Arij Makati is going to be hosting that conversation next week. We encourage you guys to follow us on social media and tweet. And at the end of today's conversation, we're going to be asking, we're going to be doing a lot of Q&A. And so with that, I'm super excited to introduce our guest for this evening. It's my friend Hanif Abdurraqib, who I'm so excited to have on. He's a poet, a cultural critic, an essayist from the east side of Columbus. And he's someone that I just have such an enormous amount of respect for. And his latest book is a poetry collection called A Fortune for Your Disaster. He's an incredible writer. I'm so excited to have this conversation. Welcome, Hanif.
Tasha, thanks for having me, man. Thanks for taking the time.
Yeah, of course. How are you doing? How's Columbus?
Columbus is okay. I think like a lot of people right now, I'm kind of like floating, or it feels like I'm kind of just floating through a really slow timeline and trying to make the most out of it. But, Columbus is good. I'm really blessed and fortunate to be in a place I love, with people I love. And, I think that's all anyone can ask for at the moment.
Yeah. I wanted to share a little bit about how we met, because it's actually one of my favorite stories, and like so much of the common connection that we had, I think really kind of set the tone for both this conversation and just a lot of the conversations that you and I've had. So we met because one, I've just been a huge fan of your work for many years, and used to write about music in Ohio. And as many as those who know me know that I grew up in Cincinnati and have a deep love for Ohio. And I remember sort of reading a lot of your writing and being touched by it. And a friend of ours, Dina Hagag, who runs this incredible organization called USA Artists, who makes these grants to individual artists and have been doing it for many years. Her and I were having a conversation, and we wanted to figure out a way to partner with them. And one of the most exciting projects that we got to do this year was partner and sponsor a grant for you to continue on and do some of the work that you're doing. And it was through that process that we got to know one another. You came to our office in Chicago, and one of the most, and it's something that I think about all the time, one of the funnest and coolest things I think a lot about was when we started talking about some of the commonalities and some of the things that we were, the music we were into and the scene and all of these things, we recognized that like we were most definitely in the same room, like in the early 2000s, like for sure. And we just didn't know one another, because like you're the only person I can talk to about like the Buzz coffee shop in Cincinnati, or Bogarts. And so I just absolutely like it was the coolest thing to have that connection with you.
Yeah, I think and two, I mean, it's also confirming in a way, right? Like I think all the time about how romantic that timeline is for me, how romantic the Midwest punk scene was. But you know, I'm someone who's lost a lot of people who were with me during that time, and so there's something about coming across someone who was also there, who also lived it, and who said like, in some way affirm this idea that I did not imagine that time in my life where I felt able, you know, and so that's really great.
Yeah, it's been amazing, and I know we're going to talk about a lot of different things, including the music that we're listening to. But I think I wanted to kind of have this conversation. I think I wanted to kick off the conversation, sort of asking you about, one thing I've been thinking a lot about, and I know you're a huge basketball fan, and I finally caught up on The Last Dance last week, and there's a whole conversation to be had about that, which we won't sort of get into, but there was something specifically that I wanted to talk about in light of sort of the events that happened this week in Minneapolis and in Central Park, which was, Jordan, whether he said it in jest or not, sort of making that famous line about, Republicans buy sneakers too, which sort of prevented or sort of kept him from being an activist per se. Whereas what you're seeing today, whether, as soon as what happened in Minneapolis, you saw LeBron posting, you've had Kaepernick. And I guess I'm wondering from your perspective, can art be devoid of politics or an agenda, or should it be? And how do you think about the role of artists in that responsibility?
I mean, of course it can be. We see all the time that it can be. And I don't know if I can speak to personally whether or not it should be on a broad scale, but I think the idea of art as a political action in some ways lies in the eyes and work of the art maker, right? And so, for example, if I go outside right now and decide to write a poem about the tree in my front yard, I think it is up to me if I want to determine the political nature of the tree itself, or my going outside as political. I think the stakes have to be defined by the person creating the work. For me and my work, it feels hard to untangle the interest and curiosity that I have about the world from any political worldview at all, right? Even if it is to understand that a part of my quest is to write about grief and affection and history. And in order to do that, I have to wade through many things. I have to wade through the loss of people I've loved and cared about, due in part, or at least due sometimes, to politics, right? I have to wade through the fact that the neighborhood I once loved doesn't look the way it used to, in part due to politics. And so, I think a defining peg in my creative interests is maybe understanding that I'm kind of always operating at a low hum of political understanding, or at least I'm understanding my presence in the creative pursuits that are pushed forward by that presence as political. I don't want to go too deep into an end and say that everything that every artist creates is political, or even everything that I create is political. And I don't want to go into I don't want to go down a road that says that my being alive in and of itself is a political action. I don't know if I really believe that. I think that I did believe that once. But I think with any luck, my being alive and loving the world as I do pushes me to a greater political action.
And so you talked, I'm actually curious to unpack that a little bit, only because how has that evolved? Like, I think that, like, you're about the same age as I am, and the world sort of, as we've thought about it, the way that it's evolved, particularly since the early 2000s, like how is the thought about what the meaning that your art takes on? Because one thing that's always so fascinating to me is how you put something out into the world, and it can be not only interpreted, but it can mean something so different to so many different people. I mean, there's specific pieces that you've written that have really, really stuck with me that, for all I know, you may not even sort of relate to today, like the way you did 5 years ago. And so, like, how do you think, how's that informed some of your writing, and how has that changed over the years when you think about particularly the world that we're living in?
Well, I think I've become more fluid of a creator, right? Like a thing that I used to always tell myself and always used to understand is that the minute I finish a piece and it goes out into the world, it's no longer mine, and I am not responsible for tracking down every emotional response to it. But what that also means is that I am I too have the agency to distance myself from that piece, right? A year later or a month later, can say, well, I no longer feel that way. I'm glad I wrote this piece because it got me to a higher level of understanding something else, but I no longer feel the way I did then. And it teaches me, I mean, the thing that I'm always learning is that every time I sit down to write, I'm sitting down with a new set of tools. And every time I finish something, every time I dive into something, I'm exiting it with a new set of tools, a new way of looking at something in the world. And so it makes sense that if I build up enough of those entries and exits, that I am not going to understand the world in the same way as I did a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago. That doesn't mean that everything I wrote 2 years ago is garbage or quote unquote wrong. It means instead, I think that the job of the critic or the job of myself is to not attempt to operate in these binaries of right versus wrong, because that feels like a fool's errand for me, right?
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be correct as much as I am trying to be curious and trying to tend to those curiosities really well, with the understanding that I might stumble into something that feels like correctness, but it might mean nothing to me in a week. And through that, through that seeking, through the eternal seeking, I find that I've divested from a lot of righteousness, or I've divested from this idea or this pursuit of self-righteousness, and instead, I'm really doing work that I hope just trains me to ask better questions of the world repeatedly, and I'm doing work that I think keeps me unsatisfied. I don't ever want to be like a fully satisfied thinker,
Yeah.
I want to remain unsatisfied so that I can keep in the pursuits that excite me most.
Yeah, and it's funny because I think a lot, like as you were talking, I think a lot about something like my dad had this sort of this fear of being content in the world. My dad always had this, one of the few lessons that he sort of taught us growing up was both to be grateful, but also to kind of constantly be curious and constantly be asking questions. And that sometimes could be really difficult when you come from my parents were very different in the way that they understood faith, and that my mom was a very kind of she just followed everything by the book, and it was very binary, and it's in its own ways it's very beautiful, whereas my dad was so much, it was a lot messier. And so for me, when I think about those dynamics of being curious, like I always found them to be a little bit challenging within that construct. But going sort of off of that, one thing that you and I have talked about is like both in this moment and in life in general is grief. You alluded to it earlier about how we process grief. And we hosted a conversation a few weeks ago about this, about this specific topic. But and I know that you and I have had sort of suffered a lot of important losses in our life. How do you think about, sort of within the context of your work, or just as a person, grief? And we've talked about how grief isn't something that's being talked about a lot, particularly in this moment. And I'm really curious as to why. So I'd love to hear sort of how you've been thinking about grief specifically.
I mean, I think a part of the reason I've worked really hard on trying to think of this moment as traumatic, and to speak of this moment as a moment where many people are going through trauma, because I think that's what it is. But it's hard for me to understand that in real time. And I think it's hard for a lot of people to understand that in real time. The idea of grief as this distant and hovering thing, it's just no longer real. You don't have to stand atop the shoulders of memory to touch grief anymore. It's present. It's in the air. We're breathing it. We're living it. And so, one, that tells me, at least for me, that this is something that will be mourned in many ways years from now. And I'm not talking about the material aspect of it. I know that there are people who perhaps will look at it from a practical lens, like the economy won't be the same in 3 years, or colleges will close. But I mean, just from a very practical, emotional, or a very like more whimsical, emotional way. I think there are ways this will haunt the interior and exterior of a lot of people's lives for years to come. right? I live in a city I love, and I am around my friends. My friends, so many of my friends that live here, so many of my friends who I love a great deal live here. And when I see them, I can't hug them, or I have to talk to them through a screen door, or I have to talk to them through a screen in order to speak to them. And that eats away, right? That eats away at our concepts around love and affection and what it is to want to hold people close after having lost so many others, right? Um, I today was talking to a friend who it's like I just don't know when I'll be able to hug my family again, right? And there's no other way to describe that for me other than trauma. This is a deep trauma that that many people are moving through, and it can't only be quantified by a death toll, although it should be all as well, obviously, and it certainly can't only be quantified by material loss. But I understand that's what people are focusing on, perhaps because it is harder um, to understand what it is to move through the constant, very thick fog of grief all the time, instead of having to um, extract the grief from some past history or some future anxiety and hold it in your hands and look at it and assess it. When the grief is kind of like a long hum consistently through the day, I think it's harder to process. And so I don't begrudge people for not talking about it. It's really because I think many people like myself just don't know. Um, I don't know what to talk about. It's like these moments where, um, a friend of mine told me this story about how um, you're more prone to cry on airplanes. Like if you fly on an airplane and you like watch a movie and you're emotional and you're like, why am I crying at this movie scene that I would never cry at normally? It's because I mean I don't know. She's not a scientist, so I don't know if this is real. So don't quote me on this if you're. But she told me this thing about how you're just like more prone to crying. You're more you're at a heightened emotional state, so you're more prone to kind of like veer off into extreme emotions. And it's like we're in the airplane all the time now, right? And so it's just like we're in this mode where at any point, I mean, for me, I've had when I talk to my friends, it's no longer how are you feeling, which it used to be. Like when this first started, I feel like everyone was like, how are you feeling? How are you holding up? Whatever. But now, when I talk to my friends, it's like, how are you feeling this week? Or how are you feeling today? Right. And so much of this pandemic timeline has even, I think, shrunk the way I think I discussed the emotional ecosystem. It's like shrunk the emotional ecosystem and the capability that I have to feel things.
I relate to that so deeply because I talk to my sister pretty frequently, and she doesn't live too far from here, and and she has almost a 1-year-old daughter, and I have not been able to literally like just like hold her and when I do go to visit, it's like sitting on the porch and it's through a door, it's through something. And I really think about how it is a day by day thing because I'll be talking to her on one day and we will feel like we feel fine, and then literally the next day, like the grief and the trauma and sort of the hurt is so much more palpable than it literally was the day before. And I guess I'm wondering too, sort of, one of the things that you talked about is how we can't quantify this by sort of only by a death toll. One of the things that you sort of talk so much about is growing up in Ohio and Columbus particularly, and sort of the changes that you've seen in your city. And growing up in Cincinnati, we've talked about this. I've seen sort of similar changes in Columbus. I lived in Columbus for a little while. I have a lot of family in Columbus. But one of the things that I think a lot about is there was this change. A lot of this was happening, obviously pre-pandemic, sort of where we were seeing the cities that we love transform into things that we may not love the same way. And I feel like that's only going to be heightened post-pandemic when you see the shuttering of small businesses. And I guess I'm wondering how you think about, my colleague Kalia said this to me once, and I really loved the way that she phrased it, which was, when you think about nostalgia and you think about the things you love, how do you process when they don't love you back in the same way? And so for me, I think a lot about that in the cities that we sort of grew up in. And how are you thinking about that in terms of just of Columbus and what you think it's going to happen in the next few years?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, there are things already closing here. Things like um, small businesses that have shut down and all that. And I will say, um, so much of the pandemic moment, or at least witnessing from afar, um, is has been witnessing a lot of people who have lived what appear to be somewhat privileged lives, struggling to deal with their loss of control, right? But I also think when you grow up a certain way, or when you grow up with in a certain place, you're already operating under an understanding that you don't have control, right? Like I grew up in a poor area of the city. I grew up in a really marginalized area of the city, and at no point during my like childhood or adolescence did I think I had control over. I felt brief bursts of freedom, but I was careful to not mistake that for control, right? Because I saw so many different ways that anytime I felt like I had control, it could be taken away. Um, and so I say that to say that um, I've long maybe made my peace with the fact that the way that I understood Columbus once is not the way it is going to be, which doesn't mean that I love it less, right? It means that I ache for it in a way that I think requires a great deal of fighting for it, right? I ache for a city and I love a city, and it requires me um, to go out and preserve whatever bits of the city I can. And I've begun to think about that less in a physical sense, right? But in a cultural sense. And how do I preserve the heart of the city? How do I preserve the people creating things in the city that I love? How do I give access to people who are making things that excite me? Because I think the conversation around gentrification specifically is often about material, or it's often about the physical losses. This building was one thing and now it's another thing. But I think what better serves that conversation is understanding that it's a cultural and historical loss too, right? Because what the painting over of an area does, or the remapping of an area does, it also erases the history of people who lived there before and before and before. Um, and a good way for me to start thinking about this is understand that like it's something that I've been complicit in too, right? And I think there's some things that um, there's some intersections here. We talk about like whether or not um, I should be or asked to be in America, whatever that means. Like I have undoubtedly the land I am on right now is not, you know what I mean, like is not what it always was, right? So by default, um, I have mapped over some other history. And so when I think about it like that, and when I talk about it like that, yes, the buildings in some ways are important. I mean, there are ways that Columbus has gone to some like wild, heinous routes, like tearing down homeless shelters to build housing, expensive housing type stuff, right? Um, but what that also says, because it's not surprising that the state doesn't care for the poor, right? It's not surprising that the state doesn't care for the vulnerable. Um, but And so the question then to me becomes less, how do I, I'm no longer asking how do I push my shoulder against the somewhat immovable wall of the state. Instead, it's kind of like, how do I uh, bring all of these people, or build coalitions to bring these people along with me to somewhere better, not even geographical, but somewhere to an emotionally better place, to a creatively better place, to a more thoughtful place. Um, and that's kind of where I'm at.
And I think, one of the things that you were doing, I think just literally, I think it was 2 weeks ago, was this for Eid, Eid al-Fitr, this writing letters campaign to incarcerated individuals. And I guess, I'm wondering, like, A, how did that project come about? And B, is that a function of what you're talking about, of ways that like youth, the city isn't, you talked eloquently about the ways that the city is not the same city that we grew up in or the city that you love, and you sort of accepted that. But the ways that you kind of bring it together, or the ways that you bring that love to the forefront, are things like that campaign that you did. First of all, I'd love to just hear about that campaign and sort of how that came about, and sort of what, and how you thought about it.
Yeah, I mean, I can't take full credit for that. I'm a part of a couple organizing groups in Columbus. the Columbus Freedom Coalition, Free Them All 614. And within those organizations, there's like a handful of Muslims. There's like 4 or 5 of us, and it was just something we put our heads together on. And I mean, if I'm being real, like I'm someone who, in my younger years, I was in trouble a lot. I was in trouble all the time. I was in and out of Franklin County Courthouse, Franklin County Correctionals, and once when I was young, I was in a Franklin County Correctional Facility during Ramadan. And I will never forget just how difficult it was for the Muslims who were incarcerated to practice, right, to fast, to pray, because prisons don't really care when you eat or don't eat, or what you eat or don't eat. And that's just one part of it, right? We're just talking about the actual nourishment. We're talking about the actual like physical nourishment, not the spiritual nourishment, not any other modes, just like actual eating, right? Which I don't want to downplay that, of course. So I'm saying that there are like several obstacles. Yeah. And one of the obstacles is isolation and loneliness, right? And feeling like there are not people in solidarity with you. And so we thought up that campaign because I've poured myself into that campaign because of that, my experience. But I think we all kind of were down to extend ourselves. We're doing campaigns around freeing folks in prison and shutting down some of these prisons in Ohio. I think caring about I think an important thing for me has not just been about, I'll word it like this, it's been about dialogue with people who are incarcerated, so I'm not outside speaking for them and their needs, right? And so it's been about running writing workshops or literally being pen pals with folks, you know what I mean? And especially now at this time, like learning about the conditions inside and what folks need inside and how we can serve them. And that was one way we found out we could serve them. The campaign was great. I mean, I think we got people from all over who wrote letters and mailed them from where they were at to Ohio, which was unexpected. You know, we thought we would just be like maybe have 8 to 10 people in Ohio writing these letters. We got people from all over. We got people from all over to kind of like listen to a small teach-in about what's happening in the prisons here. And I think that kind of small needle moving is what I'm really invested in. A long time ago, a homie told me, one of my OGs told me, like, if you are committed to this type of work, if you're committed to justice work in any way, however you define justice, you will not likely live to see the world you are fighting for, right? Which is weak in some ways, but freeing in other ways, because I think of my work instead as just really attempting to loosen the bricks on a wall that will be later torn down with ease. Right. That is the hope, is that I'm chipping away and making these small incremental chips at this wall so that enough bricks will be loosened so that a generation after mine can come and just kind of nudge it over. And I don't need to see that end result, right? I need to feel as though there is promise in the world I'm leaving behind, whatever that might be. And so that's kind of the road I've been going down.
That acceptance, I think, I think about that all the time. Like, I think about that particularly within the context of Pillars, the organization, that, you know, I started this with a handful of friends like years ago. And there was this realization that we had a couple of years into it, was that if we do everything right, if we, you know, because the goal here was just literally, the goal of this organization was that I just wanted to support Muslims. Like, that was it. There was no sort of like huge mission statement where I was going. I knew there was amazing Muslims out in the world doing incredible work, and I just wanted to divert some resources towards them, because I've seen some of the most incredible art, some of the most incredible things that have been dear to my heart have come from Muslims, and I just wanted to support that. And one of the things that you realize as you get deep into this work is exactly what you're talking about, is that you are just loosening that brick, because I don't, you know, we think about a world in which we want to be free of sort of anti-Muslim discrimination, particularly within the context of Pillars. And I recognize that I may not see that in my lifetime. And that's not what I can build. And that's not what I can do this work for. It's about sort of laying the groundwork and hoping that there's a generation, there's people, young people who are going to come and take over this work and do it 10 times better than we ever could. And that's really always been the goal. And that acceptance, I think, as I'm really glad that you brought that up, because it's hard to accept sometimes when you're pouring yourself and your heart into, whether it be your art, whether it be an organization, whatever it might be. It's really, it can be really challenging to sort of accept that sometimes, I find.
Yeah, and I also think, and I don't mean to be like, oh, one thing I always try. I'm maybe too cynical, which I think is a criticism of me that is probably very true. Um, but I don't want to be all doom and gloom, and I want to say too that in the meantime, there are several ways that we can all build little corners of freedom for ourselves and our people, right? Um, Places that people can go and feel free and excited to be alive. Be it, I think about No Name with the book club that she did. I think about like my homie Eve has like a black board game night where people just gather, like black folks just gather and play board games. Like I think about these things too, because I think that type of action is how one recharges themselves for the next fight, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I've been thinking a lot about how we recharge ourselves in this moment, particularly. But I feel so fulfilled and so thankful to get to organize with folks in the city I love, which I've been doing for a long time. I mean, I came up organizing, and I came up, and it looked so different than it did now, right? I am so thrilled to be in a space where there's not an organizing hierarchy as there once was, where it's like, all right, there's the one charismatic leader, often male, right? Now, I feel like these movements that I'm a part of are led by folks younger than me. They're led by trans folks, queer folks. They're just led by like black folks from, and folks of color who are coming from a lot of different paths, and kind of everyone's meeting each other where they're at. And the central aim is do what you can from where your position is, right?
Yeah.
And I think that is vital, and that's the thing I did not understand about organizing or any kind of justice work when I was younger. All right, it was all about like, how can I, in one swing, save the entire world? That's like me at like 20. But now it's kind of just like, well, how can I do things from where I'm at?
Yeah. I feel like we have to talk music. I feel like we just have to talk music for a couple of different reasons. One, I think, we're both huge, like we grew up sort of in similar ways in terms of the music that we were listening to at that time. But also it's funny because my colleagues, you might have seen on social media, I hadn't actually read this article that you had written about Zayn Malik, like for, I think it was like MTV, like a couple of years ago. And it was a really, it was a beautiful piece, and I'd encourage everyone to go check it out. I believe we posted it on our social, and there was a couple of things in that piece that resonated with me, and the one which I just want to point out, you don't even have to react to it. It's something that meant something to me a lot, because you've talked about sort of the weight of your name, and sort of being in spaces like Ohio, and sort of both, not just sort of the meaning of the name, but literally the pronunciation. And I struggle with this a lot. Like, my name is Kashif. I, like, everyone in Ohio and Cincinnati, like, just defaulted to Kashif. And like, I heard that like my whole life, and I didn't, and it just sort of like, many times when I was young, kind of went with it. And it wasn't until I got older where I started to really recognize the weight and the meaning of what, of your name. But also, like, you talked really eloquently and like really beautifully in that article about sort of music, and you've talked about music, like that's such a huge part of what you've written about. And what I've really, really loved so much about so many of your writings, whether it be that Zayn Malik piece, whether it be other thing, is you think about music and you think about its role in your life in deeper than any person I've ever met. Like, you literally, like, I saw this tweet from you a couple of like months ago, which like cracked me up, which I think you were like, which albums would you resequence if you could resequence them? Like, and it was like, it was so, it was things that I love thinking about, but I don't often, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you, A, like, what are you listening to right now? B, how, like, and this is a much bigger question, but like, how do you think about music in terms of sort of the way that it's helped you sort of navigate a lot of these struggles that we're talking about? Like, where, how have you thought about the role of music in your life?
It's so funny. I remember that sequence. It's funny. The sequencing tweet came because I was in a um, I was taking part in this thing where I was asked to give my top 10 album openers of all time, and I had said Block Parties. I was like Block Parties Banquet, you know, and
Yeah.
everyone was like, no, that's not an album opener. And I was like, of course it is. Why wouldn't it be? You know, that's a perfect album song. And I looked and it wasn't. And I was like, I would resequence that. So that's what right now I'm listening to a lot. I mean, I'm so that's like a twofold answer. I am listening to a lot of new stuff. There's this band Wednesday that has an album called um, I was trying to explain you to someone, I think it's called, and I love it. The new Fiona Apple, of course, the new Mozzie album. Um, there's like, you know, I listened to the new 1975 album last week when it came out. It's very long. It's just too long.
I didn't like it.
Yeah, I mean, we don't have to go on a whole thing. You know, weird thing about 1975 is that their first album was so great to me because it was before they started to buy into their own sense of self-importance, you know what I mean? And so they just made like these kind of fun, ridiculous songs that no one was supposed to take seriously. And then around their second album, I think it was like, okay, now you have to take this band seriously. And they were like, you have to take us seriously. But the music did not rise to the level of that assertion. And then the third album, they went full like we're the biggest and most important rock band alive. And it's like, I don't know, guys, come on, just make the silly song. But I also, like a lot of people, find myself folding back into the music of my teenage years and early 20s just because I think the familiarity gives me comfort. It's been hard for me to listen to unfamiliar things in unfamiliar times. And so there are ways that I'm kind of clinging to, you know, so Friday and Saturday is my like new music listening day. And then after that, and I'm someone who usually stays with new albums for a long time. But after Friday and Saturday, I kind of set them aside and go back to, you know, the music of my youth. I'm also working on a project that will probably drop next week. So I don't want to talk too much about it, but I'm probably going to hit you up about it separately because I would love to get
Yeah,
you.
no, I'd love to. But feel free to like, mention it. I saw something on Instagram.
Yeah,
Feel free to mention
I'm
it.
working on this. I'm working on this project called 6805, which is a like a musical play. It's like a playlist and archival project. So it started in I was in Iowa teaching in this past school semester until I was not in Iowa teaching this past school semester. But while I was there, I was alone. You know, I was like alone, and in most of my nights, I was just kind of like sitting around. And I started thinking about the years and decades that defined my musical tastes. And so not only the music that I came to love, but the music that my people loved, you know, the music that my parents or my siblings loved and passed on to me until I built my own kind of maps through music. And I figured out that the decades that defined my musical taste were the like late 60s to the early 2000s, right? If I'm thinking about like elders, siblings, friends, me, if I'm building a tree, it goes from 1968 to 2005. And so I was like, I want to make playlists of, you know, like 75 to 80 of, I think, the most important songs from each of these years. And I started doing that. And then when the pandemic hit, I was like, I really want to expand this idea. And so I'm not a very good website builder, so it took like a month for me to build a website or more. And I just did all these deep dives. So there's like archival magazines. There's a lot of archival concert footage for each year, and there's only 8 playlists done because I want to kind of roll them out slowly. But another function of the site is that I'm going to hit up some of my dear friends and like poet friends, musician friends, music friends, and I'm just going to give them a 5-year window and tell them to pick any album within that 5-year window and write, 700 to 1,000 words on it. And we're going to put that up as well every now and then. So it'll also be a place where people can write about albums they love so that it's not just centered on me and my own obsessions. You know what I mean? Because I think left to my own device, like my own obsessions are boring outside of, and so I really wanted to make it a place where there could be some kind of communal understanding of fandom. And so all that's very exciting. How I think about music, I think a funny thing is that before I even knew the way that music kind of stitched itself into my understanding of my anxiety and my desire to escape, it was happening. I didn't grow up in a household that I think anyone would call like abusive or so it's not like I was constantly in a need for escape, but I also knew at a young age that I kind of had this hovering sense of discomfort with the world. And the only time that I felt a little bit distant from that was with headphones on. It was someone who recorded songs off the radio, and I would give anything for that excitement of sitting by the radio all day, waiting to hear your song, getting to press record on the cassette, right?
Yeah.
How do I prolong that feeling of triumph? But by listening to the song on headphones over and over again and remembering that moment. How do I, as I got older, it was kind of like, how do I replicate this feeling of making a mixtape that is a perfect mixtape, other than by giving it to someone else and watching them smile as the first song starts to hit, right? And so there are so many ways that music took me outside of my body and into a newer, better, or slightly different place. And there are so many ways that music very literally saved my life and the life of some people around me, right? Not all, we're not so lucky that we get to keep everyone, but there are enough people still living that I love where I can say it is this album or this song or this story that pushed you back from the brink and you're still with us. And so I feel like I owe music a great deal of gratitude, and I believe it should be taken seriously. And I don't just believe that I should take it seriously for myself, but I believe that I should take it seriously for other people as well. So much of it's funny that you brought up the Zayn Malik piece, because so many One Direction fans reached out to me after that, and they were all so excited. It's weird because I think when the Stan Wars were kind of in era 2, when it was like era 2 of the Stan Wars on Twitter, whenever that was, like 2015, 2016, the One Direction fans were really in my corner, which was it was like having a protective shield around. But it's because, and one of them emailed me, and I'll never forget, and they were kind of like, and this like made me feel like a dinosaur, but nonetheless, they're like, no one your age ever takes our music, the music we love, seriously. Like, no one writes about this seriously. And, I came up at a time where older people didn't take the music I love seriously. And I'm constantly trying not to replicate that. I'm trying not to replicate the behaviors that made me feel like the music that saved my life was small, right? Like, you can't tell me that this thing I'm listening to is small and inconsequential because my friend is still breathing because of it. And so I really want to project that onto the greater landscape. And I want to take music seriously. I don't want to differentiate between like high class and low class. I want to write about boards of Canada with the same enthusiasm that I write about Carly Rae Jepsen, or I want to write about Buffalo Springfield with the same enthusiasm that I used to write about Ariana Grande. I suppose I'm not a big Ariana Grande fan, but if I were a bigger fan, I would write enthusiastically about Ariana Grande.
Well, it's funny because I think a lot about what you're talking about, because I grew up in my parents. I love my parents. They tried. I'm trying not to like be too mean, but they were difficult. Like, they were very difficult, and they had a very tumultuous relationship. And when they did finally get divorced, it was really difficult for me. It was very, very challenging for my sister and I. And one of the things I think a lot about, and at that same time around like my 15, 16, my mom was a very religious woman. So she was sort of like being like, hey, you got to go to Sunday school. You got to do all these things. And I was just kind of like a dumb 15-year-old who was like, I was so into music. And it was actually Bad Religion, Stranger Than Fiction. Like, when that album came out, that like, I would take it. My mom would take me to these like parties that I did not want to go to. And I would have to just sit in the corner with these kids who like I had nothing in common with. Like, I would like have my Discman and I would just like listen to these albums. And it's funny you were talking about sort of the unfamiliar, sort of not wanting to cling to the unfamiliar, because I find that like I've been finding that all the music that I've been listening to over the last like 2 or 3 months has been when I was listening to when I was like 17, 18, 19 years old, and like kind of revisiting a lot of that music and thinking about what it sort of meant to me, and those were powerful moments. Like that album, which is it's a funny album because they're very political and sort of social. So there's nothing warm about that album, but I just loved it sonically. And so like for me, it was this like I just would listen to it on repeat, and it helped me cope like during a very, very challenging time in my life. And so I hear you, and I really sort of appreciate that sentiment, and that's what kind of comes through in so much of your writing.
And
So I
I mean,
want.
it's like Sorry, I'm sorry. I'm just like
No, no,
uh,
I know. I'm trying. I could talk about music like the whole time, but please
the
continue.
familiar. I think what I've loved the most is knowing where like when I say I'm returning to familiar albums, it's because I I I like to know where I'm going to land. It feels like so much. I mentioned earlier. It feels like we're constantly falling very slowly through several thick clouds of grief with no end in sight. And so I like a song that I remember. I like a song that I know. I like knowing where I'm going to land. I like knowing that if I put the needle down, we were listening to this Emmylou Harris record I liked the other night. And I know if I put the needle down anywhere on that record, after a few seconds, I'll be able to hum my way to an entry point. There's a comfort in that. There's comfort in that for me always. But there's comfort for me in that, particularly now, when I feel like it's hard for me to predict what's around the corner.
Yeah. So we try to leave the last like 10, 15 minutes or so for questions, because I know a lot of people were super excited about this conversation, about you, not about me at all. And so I'm going to read off some questions, and we'd love to just sort of hear your thoughts. So, someone says, it's almost summer. We can't go to the beach, but we can still read. What's on your reading list? Like, what are you reading these days? What do you recommend? It's a big question, but I'd love to hear that.
Yeah, I'm kind of back into poems. I say that because I feel like as much as I'm not really governed by genre when I write, and as much as I really try to push back against these rigid ideas of genre when I write, I am immensely governed by genre when I read, which is probably not ideal. But like when I'm in poetry reading mode, I'm only reading poems and that's it. When I'm in nonfiction mode, I'm only reading nonfiction and that's it. And it's usually opposite of whatever book I'm working. So I just finished my next nonfiction book, and I've been reading poems. So I've been reading the Gabrielle Calvacaresi book, The Last Time I Saw Amelia Earhart. I've been reading the book, rereading the book Map to the Stars by Adrienne Batika, who is a poet I love a great deal, and who is someone I think who's a massive influence on my work. Map to the Stars is a book about being like this book of poems about being a young Black kid who moves to the suburbs of Indianapolis, and has to find their way through that. And I've been so I've been revisiting a lot of poems. I'm trying to get a better fiction reading practice. I did, a fiction book I did read and love, though it's not out yet, is the new Brian Washington book, Memorial. I got like a galley of that and really loved it. And it's not that I really truly love fiction. But I have such a hard time finding myself to reading it, not because I think it's tedious or boring or bad, but because I think my brain has just like wired me to the reading of poems in such a way that fiction feels like a little bit more insurmountable at times.
It's funny. I have the same. It's actually very challenging for me. I tried to make the goal over the last like 2 months. Like one of the goals I made for like quarantine was to only read fiction. I lasted like a month, and then like there was like so many different books that I wanted to read that again, it's not a. And it's funny that you talked about genre, because one of the questions too that was brought up was specifically on your opinion on genre, and sort of if you have any favorite projects that I guess quote unquote redefine genre, because you talk a lot about that. So it was a question that came up that I think is I'd love to hear from you. Just maybe expand on.
Yeah, I mean the book Zong, which is like a book. It's like a sound poem. Really reshapes the idea of genre for me in terms of how language can be instrumental, which is something I wholeheartedly believe in. I think the book Dictée, which I like tried to teach this year before the pandemic, is a really difficult and challenging book that blends. When the book came out, and it was by Brenda and Teresa Cha. She was murdered in 1982, right after the book came out, maybe a week after the book came out. And so because of that, the book didn't get the entry into the world it deserved, but it also didn't get to be defined by the author itself. It ended up having to be defined by the people who were consuming it, which is a faulty bit of machinery anyway. But so it got labeled as fiction, and it got labeled as nonfiction, but it's really several things. It's a hybrid text. It's fiction, nonfiction, poetry, and it's visual. And it really, I think, asks the question of looking. right? Um, what do what does a photo tell you without speaking? Or what does a captionless image speak into the world for you? And so I think I like things like that that really challenge a reader to take some accountability for what they're looking at and ask questions of what they're looking at as opposed to just consuming a vision. Um, and so those two books really jump out for me. But, um, my hope is that at some point, questions of genre are obsolete. I think that um, I come from um, a line of storytellers in some ways, right? And so, what then is the genre of my father, for example, who tells stories, who sometimes would tell the same stories but tell them a different way each time, right? And with each retelling of a story, it became larger or more whimsical or more beautiful. So is my father a fiction writer? Is my father a magician? Is my father a griot? Like I think that I come from people who kind of hold stories within themselves, like hold stories and move through the world with stories in their bodies and their minds and their hearts. And that in some ways when they're pushed out into the world, they become genreless, right? Um, the spoken tradition. Like I think about the spoken tradition and how the stories I heard growing up from the people I loved could have been anything.
Yeah.
They were as nonfiction as they were flash fiction, as they were poetry, as they were collage.
Yeah, I think it's funny we talk about orals, like the oral histories, like Zahir Ali, who you I think briefly met before we did this,
Yeah,
who is working with Pillars as a senior fellow and is a dear friend and someone I love and admire so much. Did this incredible project that we funded a few years ago called Muslims in Brooklyn, which collected these oral histories of the Muslims who shaped Brooklyn. And like on the surface, it sounds like an amazing project, and it was. But when you actually heard like with your own ears like these stories, they did this beautiful exhibit in Brooklyn, and you got to go and hear some of these stories. It just took on a completely, like, it was one of the more profound experiences of my life because I knew the project was interesting. It was awesome. But to hear those stories and to hear them, I think a lot about that. And he sort of inspired me to kind of capture some of the immigration stories of my family. Like my dad, I tell this to a lot of my friends, like my love of music comes from my dad, who literally immigrated to New York in the late 70s and to go to art school and lived around the corner from CBGB's and like was there at the height of, was going
yeah,
to see like the Talking Heads and Blondie and the Ramones, like, like he would go see these. And so we grew up with this sort of just like these stories of like, he's like, yeah, I went to go see Pink Floyd in Amsterdam. And just like, and I'm like, what? I don't even know. What are you talking about? Like, how did that
right.
happen? What is that? Tell me about that story. And so I think a lot about that. And that project was really kind of eye opening. And it was one of my absolute favorite things that I got to do. Um, I'll go to another question about so where do you want to go with your work? Is there anything that you haven't explored yet? I think one thing about you that's like you've written so much and it's really incredible. And so is there a place that you haven't gone? Are there things that you want to explore that maybe you haven't done so?
Maybe, I mean, you mean writing work? I don't know if there's like writing I want to explore. I was thinking today my dream job is, which will never happen probably, is that I want to be the person who like scores TV shows or movies or like creates the music, like being I thought about this because um, I had to tap out of Mindhunter in the middle of season one, the show, just because like it just doesn't feel like a moment where I can pull the stories of serial killers, maybe. You know what I mean? I think, or that intimate of a story with several serial killers. But someone was like, you got to watch the opening scene of season 2 of Mindhunter because they use one of my favorite Roxy Music songs is "In Every Dream Home a Heartache." And the opening scene of season 2 uses it so brilliantly. Like I think it's one of the best song scene pairings I've ever seen in anything. And I was thinking today, like, I mean, I thought this for a long time, but today I was like, gosh, I feel like I could do that job. It's one of those things that when you're a kid, or at least for me, when I was a kid, I saw a fire engine speed past our house, and I was like, I want to do that job because it's loud and the truck is red, you know? Um,
Yeah.
And so I'm having a lot of that. Those every time I see something like that, I'm like, I want to do that job because I love music and I love moving pictures. And so
Yeah.
that wasn't the question the person was asking, but that is where my head is at right now in terms of, because of course there are things I want to explore in my work, but my hope is that I haven't discovered them yet, or my hope is that I haven't figured out the best way to explore them that will serve me and my curiosity. So it's that thing I said in the beginning about just consistent seeking. Um, I sometimes think that the best way for me to operate as a writer and as a person who thinks about the world is to remain in that mode, and let the decisions arrive to me when they're ready for
me. Yeah, it's funny because music has been such a love of mine, and when you talk about sort of a dream job of scoring, like I read this interview with Brett Gurewitz, who started Epitaph Records, and like Epitaph has been around for so long now. And he was saying like his job now is just like listening to new artists and figuring out like who he wants to sign. And I was like, that sounds like the greatest. Like he just constantly like has to find and listen to new bands. He doesn't always pick the right ones. Actually, they often picks the wrong ones these days. But that's another conversation. But I was thinking about that as you were talking about these like these things that we can often sort of fantasize about. But I think we're just about out of time, and I want to, I guess, this has been such a wonderful and lovely conversation.
Wait,
since we've,
can I ask you something? Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, of course.
Only because you mentioned it. What's your favorite all-time Epitaph Records band? It can be a band that like started on Epitaph and then moved elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, it has to be Bad Religion, right? I think it's funny because they're the band that had probably the biggest impact on me as a kid. Because it's funny, like they were the first band. I grew up in and I'm very proud to be Muslim. And I grew up in a sort of, my dad wasn't around a lot, and my mom was the one who kind of really raised us. And the way she taught us about faith and Islam was, like the way she understood it was that it was just like the fact that God exists, the fact that Islam is a truth was like the sky is blue. Like there was just no sort of wavering, which is a very beautiful thing. And I grew up like that for a long time. And it wasn't until bands were like, they were kind of like questioning some of these structures where I was like, oh, wait, I didn't even know it could not be like in my idea that people could potentially not believe in a God. Like was like, I was like, what are you talking about? That doesn't even make any sense to me. So they sort of really they really kind of had a profound impact on me. But there's a ton of records. I mean, even some of the Propagandhi, which like you can probably see here or there, is one of my absolute favorite bands who had like a huge impact on me politically. Like, they were writing about like trans rights and writing about feminism. Like when I was reading about this stuff when I was like 15, 16 years old. I didn't fully understand it at all. And I go back and read some of those, and they're kind of on Epitaph now. But if I had to sort of pick one sort of record, it would probably be Recipe for Hate, and which was their last record before they went to Atlantic, and then they came back to Epitaph in 2001. But Recipe for Hate was probably the one that really kind of, that one did it for me. It still holds up. It's a fantastic record. So, okay. So with that, we're gonna go ahead and close. Hanif, I just wanted to. I am such an enormous fan of yours. I'm so privileged to consider you a friend, and it's been so wonderful getting to know you and sort of work with you. And I'm just so indebted that you wanted to join us for this conversation. It means a lot to us.
No doubt. Thank you for having me. I hope we talk soon.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks.